Right, hello everybody, and welcome to the next episode of the Borg Skeptic show. Tonight we've got a special episode. I'm close to 100 subs. I think I've got 98 subs now, so hopefully we'll get them last two tonight, and then I can have a separate YouTube URL for the show, which was very exciting. So tonight we've got with us, we have Justin O'Donnell, the Fad, as the co-host. Welcome, Justin.
Nice. Thank you. Always glad to be here, Katie.
And we also have our special guest tonight, which I'm really looking forward to the conversation we're going to have, Eric Hernandez. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. I can't wait to talk to you either, or as well.
I will shout out those who we have in the chat at the moment. So we have obviously the Fad, who's co-hosting. We have Dolly. Welcome, Dolly, to the stream. I haven't seen you here before. I hope you enjoy. We have Joshua, the Catalyst. How are you doing, Josh, tonight? And that's all we have for now. So, right. So the conversation we're going to be having tonight, I think the topic we chose, Eric, was consciousness and the soul.
Yeah.
Yeah, so very, very interesting topic, and I'm looking very forward to this. So, would you like first to just give us a little bit of a rundown about yourself?
Sure, yeah. Like I said, my name is Eric Hernandez. I'm the apologetics lead for the Baptist General Convention of Texas, which encompasses anything from speaking at churches or doing trainings or seminars in evangelism and apologetics to doing conferences every year that I do with the convention, where our churches host throughout the state of Texas.
Yeah,
sounds like you keep
really
pretty busy.
Yeah. It can definitely get busy.
Yeah, it's important to keep busy, especially with the last year that we've been having. It's been a tough year, hasn't it?
Yeah, it's been quite different. It's been something else.
So, God, just his little introduction, I can't even believe how many questions exploded into my mind. But do you want to start kind of with giving your definition of, well, he said we're going to be talking about soul and consciousness. Will you give your definition on both of those so we kind of better understand what you're going to be talking about?
Yeah, I'd love to. Yeah, thanks for asking. So I hold to a position what's traditionally known as substance dualism, and basically it's the view that the easiest way to put it is when I use the word I, that's an indexical word that refers to something. It's like saying here or there. These are indexical words that are they're referring to something else. When I say the word I, I'm referring to something, namely me, myself. So I, as a conscious subject, is what I refer to when I say the word I. And when I say the word I, I'm referring specifically to what I would call the soul. So I am a soul and I have a body. So it's not that I, quote, have a soul, but on my view, quite literally, I am a soul that has a body, and a body without a soul would just be a corpse. So to define it, a soul, I would say, is an immaterial substance that is a possessor of consciousness and is the very thing that animates and develops and forms a body. It's responsible for grounding what I am, who I am, my nature, my capacities, my identity through change, which we can get into later. So without going too deep, just for now, we could say that the soul is an immaterial substance that contains consciousness and animates the body. Now, of course, the next question would be, what is consciousness? Now, consciousness can be defined a few ways, but the best way to do it is consciousness is something that would be defined ostensively. So what that means is it's something you define by giving an example of or by pointing to. So if you were to ask me, to define the color purple, I wouldn't necessarily do it by giving you some type of propositional definition, but I would point to something, which would mean that someone who's born blind, I couldn't define to them the color purple in that way. So you would have to have had an experience with it already to know what I'm talking about in order for me to cite an example or give an instance of it. So that first of all, that's how it'd be defined. Now, consciousness we can think of kind of like water can be in three different states. Water being a substance can be in the states of solid, liquid, or gas. I would say that the soul is a substance, and the soul has a capacity for consciousness, and there are 5 states of consciousness, and the 5 would be thoughts, beliefs, desires, sensations, and acts of will. So those would be so that's what consciousness would be. It'd be anything that's going to fall into those 5 states. So my soul is a substance, and it has different states and properties. There are 5 states of consciousness, and again, just really quick: thoughts, beliefs, sensations, desires, and acts of will. And when we understand what consciousness is, it tells us about the thing that's going to possess him, and I would say that would be the soul. That's a quick rundown. Yeah.
Well, that's very interesting because I do like how you've gone quite in depth there into, usually you just get quite, the consciousness and the soul these two ideas tend to get like mushed together. So I like how you've separated them out into the different states. That's very interesting. Now I'll put forward what I think of as the obvious. Now I don't believe that the soul exists, but I'll put forward what my definition of the consciousness is. So my definition is quite a simple one, which is simply our awareness, the fact that we are self-aware of ourselves and others. That's what I put forward as the consciousness in my definition.
Yeah, and that's it. Definitely is a type of awareness, and I would say that would just fall into one of the 5 states. So the reason I go to 5 states is because there are distinctions between the two. So maybe being self-aware would be something perhaps sufficient for consciousness, but maybe not necessary. So there are times when you're talking about a certain state of affairs, there are certain conditions that are sufficient to bring about those state of affairs or to qualify as a certain state of affairs, but not necessary. So I could say it raining is a sufficient condition for my grass being wet, but it's not necessary for my grass to be wet because I could use sprinkler system, whatever. So so while I'm not necessarily disagreeing, I'm just saying, yeah, that would be one aspect of what consciousness is. So one of the reasons I give the 5 states. So take like the first 2, thoughts and beliefs. There's a difference between thoughts and beliefs. Sure, there's they're correlated, they're interrelated in even some aspects, but the easiest way to put it is I can have thoughts that I don't believe, but I can also believe things that I'm not currently thinking. So since there's a distinction, these would have to be 2 different types of states themselves. And then one thing I would argue, because I'm assuming, maybe I should ask, would you say that consciousness is something physical, or what would you say it is?
So when I delve into that question, so the byproduct, the things that create the consciousness, what the consciousness is tied to, the brain, is physical. So the neurons firing, the chemicals being released. But the consciousness in my mind is an emergent property from the processes of the brain. So itself is sort of an illusion in my mind. It's what the brain does to explain the causation. The effects from the causation of brain chemicals and neurons firing and things like that. That's how I would explain that.
Okay, yeah, and tell me, and are you okay with just kind of going back and forth like this, talking about it?
That's absolutely fine. I would say for the purpose of this conversation, I am quite happy to go along with your definition of the consciousness. I would agree that those 5 states are all part and parcel of it, so I'm quite happy to go along with that for the sakes of this conversation.
Okay. Yeah, because I forgot, that I guess I'm supposed to be one being interviewed, then I'm asking you questions because I was just curious to some of the things you said.
That's fine. This is a conversation, so.
Awesome. Okay, sweet. So, okay, so it seems then like, well, I guess I should just, maybe before probing into what you're saying, maybe I can go further into detail on my case. Would that be good?
Yeah, that's absolutely fine by me. Just go a little bit. Let's get a little bit deeper, definitely.
Okay. Yeah. So So whenever I give a case for the existence of the soul, I take this like a 2-point approach, so to speak, or I aim to prove 2 basic points. The first being that consciousness is not physical, and the second being that I am more than a brain and body. And you can put it differently, that I'm not reducible or identical to brain and body. I'm something more, namely a soul. So going to the first point, consciousness is not physical. When you look at Leibniz's law of identity, it's a basic principle that states that if 2 things in question are the same, say some A and some B, if A is the same thing as B, then whatever is true of A is going to necessarily be true of B and vice versa, because we're just talking about the same thing using 2 different terms for it. So if I said Eric Hernandez, which is me, of course, and Kendall's husband, that's my wife's name, well, whatever is true of Eric Hernandez is going to be true of Kendall's husband, because we're talking about the same person. So all the properties, states, whatever the case is, my height, weight, it's all going to be the same because it's the same person. But in principle, if I can discover something true of one that's not true of the other, then even if I initially thought they were the same thing, it turns out they can't be the same thing. So let's take this notion and apply it to a reason why I would say that consciousness is not physical. Because the other position you would have, if there is no God, then I would argue that the most consistent position to take would be what's known as strict physicalism, which is a view that human beings are purely physical objects composed only of purely physical properties and parts. So consciousness, if it existed, would have to be identical and or reducible to something physical like the brain. So you have these 2 notions. You have the brain, then you have the mind. Now, if they're the same thing, which I would argue they would have to be, then given Leibniz's law of identity, whatever is true of one is going to have to be true of the other. But I would say that is easy to show that they're not the same thing because they have different properties. So let's take a state of the brain. When I have a certain feeling of pain, there are certain C fibers firing off. So there are certain neurons in my brain firing. And then there's this correlation of this feeling of pain. So take a brain state, any given neurons firing, and take like a state of like a thought or belief. My thoughts and beliefs can be true or false, but neurons firing doesn't even make sense to call them true or false. Now, my brain can be in a state which weighs 3 pounds, but the belief that I'm talking to you right now doesn't weigh 3 pounds. My brain can be in a state of being 7 inches long, but the smell of a rose or the taste of a banana is not 7 inches long. And then the joke is, so while we may be having heavy thoughts, we're not going to go buy a neck brace after the show. So while I can give many more examples, the point would simply be that if there are things true of my mind that are not, doesn't even make sense as a category fallacy to attribute these to the brain, so they're not true of the brain, then it follows that if consciousness exists, it's not identical nor reducible to something physical like the brain. So that would be the first part. I'll go ahead and stop there to see if there's any questions or comments or pushback.
I actually, whenever I dropped out, it was because I was trying to unmute. I do have a question for you. You were talking about the 5 levels of consciousness. And I don't know if you actually answered this, because some of it, of course, I missed. But why, like, where do you get these 5 levels, and why are there only 5 levels? Could you explain a little bit more to me about these 5 levels of consciousness?
Yeah, so I wouldn't call them levels; I'd call them states. So you have so what we're talking here is metaphysics, and you have substances, you have states, and you have properties. So let's just focus on something physical like water. It's a substance, and it can be in the state of being a solid, liquid, or a gas. So the substance remains the same. Its states can change, and as the states of the substance change, so do the properties. So when the water as a substance is in the solid state, it has a property of being hard. When water's in the a liquid state, it has a property of being, say, wet. When water, and so on and so forth. So there are 5 states of consciousness. I want to call them levels because that would seem to, bring in some baggage or imply some type of hierarchical order. And now, why 5? Well, because I would argue that anything that any conscious state you can point to is going to fall under one of those 5 categories. Could there be more? Sure. I just don't see. I just see that anyone that you define is going to be falling under one of those. And why say this, or where does this come from? I can point to a lot of scholars who specialize in philosophy of mind who talk about these 5 states. Some of my favorite would be like J.P. Moreland, Richard Swinburne. You even have atheist or agnostic philosophers working in philosophy of mind, like Jaegwon Kim, who's not a believer and has some really interesting arguments. And what's his name? Thomas Nagel wrote a book not too long ago called Mind and Cosmos, where he basically argues that if we just look at the world and how it came about naturalistically, you're not going to be able to account for consciousness. And I think he's right there. But yeah, without going any further than that's how I would kind of clarify what you're asking about those 5 states.
Cool. Thank you. I think you gave a great answer to that. So thank you for clarifying. You have any questions for Katie? Because I'm sure I could pull another one up.
Yes. So what we were talking about before there about the... You know what? It's completely gone now, my thought. I really need that brain fart graphic.
Hey man, I do it every single time, so it's just a tradition around here. It's okay. We've cursed Eric now. I don't know. Maybe he's above the level of brain farting, but
I can imagine he is.
I get soul farts sometimes.
Okay. Soul farts.
Yeah. So I was. So yeah, I think it was along the lines of. Was we were talking about how the you know, the thoughts aren't like sort of properties of the brain sort of thing. So and you know what, I'll get back to it because you know, if you've got a question, Justin,
that's the best way, just because the more stress you put into it, the harder it is to remember it. So you may have answered this with your last answer. Like I say, I'm a layman in a lot of ways, but how far down would you say a state of consciousness goes whenever it comes to living beings on this planet?
Yeah, great question. So I would say when it comes to consciousness, the way we would know anything else is conscious, because this gets into what's called the problem of other minds, is basically it's going to have to be through an inductive way, which I think is justified. But when I look at, let's say, my dog, and I see that, I notice that, let's say, my dog gets her paw on a nail, and, you know, she yelps. And I think to myself, you know, when I've stepped on a nail in the past, you know, I kind of shouted too and made a similar kind of flinch. And I remember what I felt when that happened, and I see my dog do that, and I think we're justified in attributing that same pain state to the dog. So we would say, oh, then that dog must be conscious in that way. And I think we're justified as when it comes to consciousness, as long as we can see how animals are analogous to us in their behavior and interactions.
So why did the dog, just because he felt pain? There's no like evolutionary reason why he squelched when he stepped on the nail.
I'm not sure if evolution would be relevant to knowing that the dog is conscious or not. I would just say, given what we know about consciousness.
Well,
I'm
sorry. I didn't mean to step on you. I was just saying that if he was if you're saying that he was conscious because, you know, I don't know if this is what you're saying, but he was conscious because he stepped on the nail and had a reaction to it. Is that what you were saying?
No, I was saying.
Okay, I'm sorry.
No, it's fine. I think what I took you to be asking was how do we know what other things are conscious is what I took you to be asking. And I would say,
absolutely.
Yeah, okay, then when we look at their behavior, and as long as I would say we can see an analogy between the way we behave in certain situations and states and the way other organisms behave in certain situations and states, I think we could attribute some type of consciousness. And so, in other words, it's going to be a case-by-case basis.
So that makes sense to me. I was just wondering though, like, so I guess dogs, perhaps, maybe, you know, and I don't think that I'm not sure. I'm not the specialist, but I don't know that we can tell that dogs have a consciousness or anything. But just from what you believe, like, would you say that like fleas have a sort of consciousness, or I just don't. I'm not sure if I understand your position well enough to know where it stops.
Yeah, a great question, and I would even say I would say I don't even know if I could. I'd have to think about it and maybe make a list of where it stops. I've never had the desire to figure out and look at everything that we know that exists that's living and see where it stops. So I would just go back to the argument what I gave and listen to 5 states of consciousness. If something has thoughts, beliefs, sensations, desires, or volition, then I would say we can attribute consciousness to those things. Can we attribute thoughts and beliefs to a dog? Absolutely. Can we attribute desires to a dog? Absolutely. Can we do that to a flea? I don't know. I wouldn't have a problem saying that fleas are conscious, but have a lower level, lower order type of consciousness. And we see this with animals all the time. When you look at, take something like an ape versus something like a rat. Obviously, there are different levels of cognition going on. Well, maybe I shouldn't say obvious, but it seems to me at least that there are different levels of cognition. There are different levels of awareness. Even when you look at dolphins, who are incredibly smart animals, you see that there are different capacities that things have. Nevertheless, I would say if something's conscious, and it's going to need a soul to ground those states in, because as I've argued earlier, and I can get back to that if you'd like, I would argue that consciousness is not something physical. So when I'm going to my 2-step approach, and I can give more arguments or reasons on thinking that consciousness isn't physical, but to kind of, I guess, add something else to the mix, and I don't mind going back and forth, like I said. So given that we know consciousness exists, and if what I've said thus far is correct, that it's not physical, which I don't see how one could argue it is, given Leibniz's law of identity, a law of logic, they share different properties, so it can't be the same thing as something physical like the brain, then the next question is, okay, well then what possesses consciousness? Because when states and properties exist and they show up in the world, they're always going to be possessed or grounded in something. So a property would be something like colors and shapes, roundness, triangularity, those kind of things. But when I'm driving in the street, I don't avoid or I don't drive with this cautiousness of trying to avoid hitting the property of redness. It's not as if redness is floating down the freeway. Instead, I avoid hitting objects that possess the property of being red. So red objects, right? So properties are going to be grounded or possessed by something when they show up in the world. That being said, conscious states and properties exist. So the question is, what is it that possesses them? So the question would be, well, what's conscious? Well, I know for sure I'm conscious. So then the question is, what am I? That's when I go to the next point, that I'm more than a brain and body. Using the same line of reasoning, Leibniz's law of identity, if something's true of A that's not true of B, they're not the same thing. Then I would ask myself, okay, then what am I? And given what we've talked about so far, the 2 options on the table that we've been discussing would be, I'm a soul, an immaterial substance, or I'm a purely physical object like a brain and body. Now, I would argue if there is no soul, that the body is just going to be some type of, what the big word is, a mereological aggregate, but we can just say aggregate for short. What's an aggregate? An aggregate is a collection of separable parts held together in a certain structure. So things like watches, Lego bricks, cars, these are aggregates. They're a collection of parts held together in a structure. So if I am just a brain and body and there's no soul, then I'm an aggregate. Now, I would say that leads into a lot of problems if that's the case. And I would just name 3, and I can go into detail if you want. But again, I'm just kind of throwing it out there. And after that, you can go wherever you guys want with it. So one would be identity through change. Purely physical objects or aggregates don't maintain identity through change or part replacement. What does that mean? To give a quick rough and ready example, a tricycle is something that possesses 3 wheels. So metaphysically speaking, if I remove a wheel from a tricycle, then in the technical sense, I can say metaphysically speaking, a tricycle ceased to exist and a bicycle came into existence, which I think shows us that purely physical objects don't maintain this identity through change. So the question would be, so the argument would be I'm either a purely physical object, an aggregate, or I am an immaterial substance, aka a soul. Well, I'm going to say AKA, but for the sake here, or soul. Well, purely physical objects don't maintain identity through change. I do maintain identity through change. Therefore, I am not a purely physical object. Therefore, I am a soul, an immaterial substance. Jaegwon Kim, the non-believer I was mentioning earlier, who's an expert also in this field, gave an interesting argument in his book on Philosophy of Mind. He says, this brain and body did not exist in 2011, but I did exist in 2011. Therefore, I am not a brain and body. I must be something more than that. The second one would be the argument from the indivisibility of personhood. And I'm going over technical arguments that I could spend hours on, but just again, to throw it out there. And there's a lot more. Yeah, thank you. And there are a lot more, just kind of throwing, I guess, my favorite out. Indivisibility of personhood. So I possess a property of being a person. Now, going back to the two positions, I'm either a purely physical object, an aggregate, or an immaterial soul, a substance, immaterial substance. If I am an aggregate, then it would mean that personhood would be what philosophers call a degreed property. So let me explain that really quick. You have degreed properties and non-degreed properties. A degreed property would be something like the property of being loud or soft. So these are properties that can fluctuate and change. They can come in percentages or degrees. They can exist in percentages. So something that is hard can be harder. Something that is loud can be quieter or louder. So these are properties that can fluctuate. Contrast that with non-degreed properties, which are properties that are all or nothing kind of things. They either are or they are not. There's no in between. They're all or nothing. So an example of that would be something like the property of being evenness. The number 6 and the number 2 are both numbers that are even, but it makes no sense to say that the number 6 is more even than the number 2, because the property of being even is an all or nothing kind of thing. Okay, so with that being said, if I am just a brain and body, or if I'm just the brain, or if I'm a combination of both, whatever the position is, well, then I would say then a consequence of that would be that personhood would be a degreed property, which would mean, so men are typically larger than women, but it would make no sense to say that I am more of a person than a woman because I have more mass and matter. But if you're gonna reduce the I, what I talked about earlier in the beginning, the word I, if you're gonna reduce that to a brain and body, then now you have persons being degreed properties. But I don't think it makes sense to say that I had, like, especially if I attribute value to being a person, then it would make no sense to say that I have more value than a woman because I have more mass and matter. If you were to cut off my arms and legs, I don't become 50% of a person. I'm still a whole person, but I do have 50% of a body. So if I can have 50% of a body and yet still be a whole person, then I would say it follows that the property of being a person cannot be grounded in something physical. It must be grounded in something else, namely my nature, me, the self, i.e. the soul. So yeah, and then the next one would be an argument from free will, and I'll just leave it at those three. And basically, if we're just a brain and body, and there is no God, then the law of causal closure would be true, which states that every physical event is going to be caused by some prior physical event. So Aristotle said this. He said, if I move a rock with my staff, then I can explain the movement of the rock by my staff. So my staff moved the rock, my hand moved the staff, but then he says, but what moved me? Now, I would define free will as being the source of your will or actions. So if I raise my hand and I'm the one that started this process that brought about my hand going up, then I had what's called libertarian free will. But if you shock me with a taser and it causes my arm to shoot up, then I was caused by something external to me, and I had no control over that. So I would say, so in that instance, I didn't have free will. So in order to have free will, you have to be the source of this chain of events, so whatever causes the action. Okay, so going back to Aristotle's rock and staff illustration, if At this point, if someone's going to deny the existence of the soul, then if they want to save free will, so to speak, then they're going to have to show that this chain of events of the hand, the staff moving the rock, to show that this person had free will, they're going to have to say that this whole chain of events started within the person. So what could that be? Well, it's going to have to be something physical. Okay, you could say, okay, a brain fired that caused my hand to move, that caused the staff to move, that caused the rock to move. So it started with me. I have free will. But I would say not so fast. If there's no God and all you are is a purely physical object, then according to the law of causal closure, every physical event is going to have a prior physical cause. So you're going to have to explain that brain firing by something. And at this point, you have two options. The first option is to say, well, another brain firing caused the other brain firing to fire. But then that just pushes back the goalpost because I could ask the same question. And then the second option, I think, which is the only option, is you're going to have to say at some point, something external to my brain, and prior to that, caused something that caused the brain firing in me to fire, then that caused the hand to move, that caused the staff to move, that caused the rock to move. But now you're no longer the first mover. You're now an intermediate mover in this chain of events, and thus you do not have free will to perform that action. Now, I think we do have libertarian free will. I'll leave that open for questions. But if someone says, okay, well, I don't believe we have free will, well, then you're going to have to give up more responsibility and rational responsibility, or what I would call intellectual integrity. Meaning and I don't mean, when I say you, I don't mean like you specifically, but so if you out there claim to be an atheist, and you claim to be an atheist on the basis of intellectual rational grounds, and if you even go as far as to call yourself a free thinker, well, if there is no soul and there is no God, then there can be no free will. So the last thing you can call yourself is a free thinker, because all your thoughts, beliefs, and actions were caused or determined by external factors beyond your control. But if you take intellectual credit for your beliefs, or your lack of beliefs, however you want to define it, because of the evidence and what you've come to understand and believe based on a logical deduction or rational reasons, then you're going to have to posit something like free will. But if free will exists, the soul exists. And then I would argue you can't have the soul unless God exists. That's a separate issue. And then, of course, going back to the moral responsibility, if there's no soul and there's no free will, then you can't hold people responsible. Just like I cannot blame a bullet or gun for murder, I blame the person. But if, much like the bullet and gun, the person was also just an intermediate mover in a causal chain of events, then it would make no sense to blame them in the literal sense as being culpable for the murder. So, yeah, just to reiterate, 2 points. Consciousness isn't physical. Second point, I'm more than a brain and body. I'm a soul. Consciousness isn't physical. I'm conscious. What am I? I gave 3 examples to show that I'm not identical or reducible to my brain or body. One is identity through change. Physical objects don't maintain identity through change. I do, so I'm not a physical object. Indivisibility of personhood. If I were just a brain and body, then being a person would be grounded in something physical like the brain and body. But we know that brains and bodies don't stay the same. They fluctuate. Some people have more or less. But if we're going to be consistent, we would have to attribute that to saying that men are more valuable or have more personhood than women. And I don't think that makes sense. And then finally, that there would be no free will. But I do think we do have free will. And to argue further, because I think we have more responsibility, and I think people have intellectual integrity for the beliefs that they hold to. So if we do have free will, then a soul must exist, because if there is no soul, there's no free will. But we do have free will, therefore, I'm not just a physical object. I must be something more like a soul.
KD,
Right,
you have anything to ask him?
Yes. So there's quite a lot of information to get through there.
Sorry about that.
We'll get onto the free will bit a bit later on, because I do have I'm a determinist at the moment, so we do have a bit of a difference there. But going back to the point that I forgot, which Cat the Humanist actually asked a question. I'll get that on screen. Yeah, Cat the Humanist was asking a question in the chat, which was similar to what I was thinking at the time, but it does lead nicely onto a point the first point I wanted to make in rebuttal to what you were saying there, which she says, does he understand different parts of the brain are used for different types of what he calls states and different types of thought processing? I'll let you answer that first before I move on.
My answer to that is yes. Next question.
Yeah. So
Let me. I'll expand a little bit more. Yes, of course. I think we've always known that there was a correlation between whatever's in here, even before neuroscience was ever discovered, before I knew anything about neuroscience. We knew that if a caveman hits another caveman over the head really hard with a club, he's going to get dizzy or pass out. So there was no question there's a correlation. It's not like, like we've barely discovered this and now it's like, oh my gosh, now we shouldn't believe in the soul. But I would say to keep it brief, I would say that it's no different than the correlation between, say, a musician and his instrument. If I play guitar or piano, so say I'm the world's greatest guitar player. I'm not. I don't play guitar. But if you were to detune my guitar, you would affect the way the music is played. So sure, there is a causal relationship between the musician and the guitar. There's even a dependence relationship. But it makes no sense to say because there's a correlation or dependence relationship, therefore they must be the same thing. And I'm not saying that's what the person's saying, but that's one thing to say towards those who would. And again, all it shows is that there's a correlation, but it doesn't show they're the same thing, nor does it show that they're reducible to the other. Nor does it mean that the music is inside the guitar. So I don't think, I would argue that your conscious states, thoughts, beliefs, sensations, desires, and acts of will, they're not in your brain, they're in your soul, but they're correlated with something physical like the brain. Just like the note C is not in a guitar or in a piano, though it is correlated with certain keys and strokes of a guitar or piano, but it doesn't mean that they're in those things.
right, yeah. I can sort of agree with that, definitely. The point I wanted to move on to, which follows on from that, is that with the brain states, is how you mentioned about how your identity doesn't change. So the I of yourself, the soul of yourself, if you will, remains constant despite changes in the body. Now, I would disagree with that in the sense of we know through neuroscience that if certain damage is done to the brain or certain different chemicals are released, i.e. with psychedelics and things like that, or electrodes are placed in the brain and different signals are sent, then the identity of the person changes. So the thoughts, the feelings, the emotions, and even down to the identity of the person, that I can actually change to something else. And I don't have on hand at the moment the research done into that, but I have read papers where neuroscientists have been doing this sort of work. So I would argue that actually the I, the identity, is corresponds to what is in the brain, corresponds to the physical. Hence, I would argue it's an emergent property.
Yeah, so I don't think calling it an emergent. Well, a few things to say to that, if I could push back. So, let me write them down before I forget. So first, it'd be good to identify or to define what I mean by identity. So in philosophy and metaphysics, when we're talking about identity through change, we're talking about something remaining the same substance at bare minimum. So, for example, I can take water and freeze it, and it'll change states, but it doesn't. But it's still water, right? It's not a different substance. I can boil it and make it into a gas, but it's still water. It's not. It doesn't change substances, and vice versa. So I'm not saying that the states and properties of a thing doesn't change. I'm saying the thing that possesses it, the substance. Remember when I said I mean the soul. I mean if I as a person am a soul, if I'm identical to my soul, then I as a person remain the same. And I would even argue that change presupposes sameness. In other words, if we're talking about change, we're talking about change with respect to something that is going to ground those changes. So in other words, even if I had brain damage and let's say I were to have a concussion and have memory loss, which I've had happen at least twice in my life. I can't remember exactly how many times, no pun intended. At least twice in my life, I've had times where I've been hit over the head and I've lost my memory, which may explain a lot. It's a really scary feeling. It's terrifying because imagine it's almost like a Freaky Friday situation where you wake up and you don't know where you're at, who you are, and who the people around you are, and you're like, "What is going on?" It's such a terror. It really is. It really is quite a terrifying feeling. But here's my question: if we're going to reduce me to just memories or brain, then at that instance, did I cease to exist, and did another person come into existence until I got my memories back, and then I went back, and then that person that kind of stepped in for that moment went out of existence, and then I came back into existence? No, I think that I was still the same person. There were just some issues with my guitar tuning, if you will. So I would say that in the sense of identity, which is known as a strict sense of identity, I remain the same, even if there are replacements of memory or parts. But again, change presupposes that there is something that is underlining that change. Otherwise, it's not a change. It's not a change in just properties. It's literally something ceasing to exist and something else coming into existence.
Well, that sounds very scientific. That's, that sounds like quantum mechanical states to me.
Yeah, and we can get into quantum mechanical states if we so wish.
I'm just saying that's just what it sounds like to me from what he's saying. The change, exactly. Just because we may be made up of one thing, everything about us is retained, even if we're made up of something completely different. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, I guess I'd have to know what you mean by that. Sounds quantum mechanical, but to answer, I guess the way it appeared to me is what I'm saying is there has to be something that's going to underline and ground those changes. So again, when if I'm just shooting from the hip here, if I'm playing a song on my guitar, and then I say play a different song, even though the song's different, it's the same. I'm playing the same guitar, is what I'm saying. So now and that can get confusing because I'm not saying the guitar is a substance or anything like that. I'm just trying to find a relation, a different type of illustration here. So I'm saying if we do maintain identity through change, then it's going to have to be grounded in something. That's, of course, assuming we maintain identity through change. People can disagree with that. But if we do, then I would argue it's going to have to be grounded in something that is a substance that is transcendent to the physical, and that's just what a soul is.
So in sense, you're saying that it's still going with the analogy of the guitar, for instance. So you can change the strings you can retune the strings on a guitar. You could change the strings on the guitar, but as long as it still has those 6 strings, it's still the same thing.
So I would say no, and that's probably why I shouldn't have used the guitar because So when I was talking about the guitar, I was just talking about changing the song because it seemed like we were talking about memories. So I'm thinking, well, maybe I can use that, and I probably shouldn't have. No, I think if you replace parts of a physical object, it's no longer the same. It's no longer the same object.
Yeah, that's what I was asking.
Oh, right.
Yeah, the illustration I usually give is the following when it comes to identity change. So, and this goes back to the ship of Theseus, that famous example in philosophy. But I kind of updated it to use just a car example. Suppose you change the tires of a car. Is it the same car? And before you answer the question, suppose you were to take every single piece of the car and replace it. Every nut and bolt, the windshield, bumpers, lights, everything. Is it the same car? Is it the original car? And then before you answer that question, suppose we take those replaced parts, put those back together, and now you have 2 cars, and the question is, which one of these 2 is the original? Now, I think regardless of your answer, I think the point is clear, and that's that they both cannot be the original, which I would argue shows that purely physical objects do not maintain identity through change or part replacement. So, that being said, it goes back to the question of whether or not you think we remain the same. If you say we don't, then I think it gets into other issues, what we would call in philosophy intellectual price tags that you're going to have to pay if you want to hold or reject a position. And if you don't think we do maintain identity through change, then you're going to have to say that there's been multiple instances in your life where, well, no, not even your life, because that would assume identity through change. There was multiple instances in time where a person that looked just like you ceased to exist, and another person that looks just like you came into existence, and this kept happening over a series of events. And I think that's quite an incredible position to hold to. But I would say that's what you would have to hold to if you're going to deny something like the soul.
So let's put a philosophical thought experiment onto the table. So let's suppose, right, we take, some point in the future, we take a human, we take a human brain, and we take away the right hemisphere of that person's brain, and then we replace it with the right hemisphere from somebody else, where the right hemisphere isn't identifying. There's some people that have this problem where the right hemisphere doesn't connect with the left hemisphere properly. Now, the parts have been changed, and now the person cannot see the right side of anybody else's face because the right hemisphere is not working. There's a very fundamental change that has been made in the way that person interacts with the world. In that thought experiment, has that person are they still the same person?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, good question. At first I thought you were going to something like what Alvin Plantinga gave as a thought experiment. But the route that you're going is, so I think the two best options would be either it's the same person that has lost some functioning, or that person that had both hemispheres cease to exist. And now this, let's say it was me. Let's say you have Eric, and then when you remove that part of the brain and whatever else you said, then now you have Eric Prime. So now it's a different Eric. It's not even the same person. It's a Eric 1 ceased to exist, and now Eric squared or Eric 2.0 whatever came into existence, and now it is literally a different person. I would say I would go with the first option. I'm still the same person, but I've lost functioning. So I can lose functioning, but that would still go into the fact that I would argue I'm not identical or reducible to my functioning. So I can still be a 100% person and the same person, but I've lost some functioning due to kind of like the guitar detuning it.
So, well, actually, you know what, Katie? I think you're on a roll here, because I'm going to derail the train. So go ahead with what you were saying.
Yeah, that was just a thought experiment that I put forward. Obviously, I would argue more for the second point, that the person has now fundamentally been changed in the physical makeup of the brain. And as seen as the consciousness is, in my view, an emergent property of that said brain, then the person, the identity of that person, has now been fundamentally changed.
Okay.
Yeah. So if I can go with that thought experiment that you're using and see what you think here. Suppose you have person A who is married, happily married. Let's say they've been married for 50 years, whatever the case is. And then this happened to person A. And let's call person A's wife Susie. When this happens to person A, you're telling me that person A has ceased to exist, and now there's a new person that exists, and person A has ceased to exist. Is Susie now single?
No, because her perception would still be that she's married to person A.
Yeah, but person A has ceased to exist, though. So then you're saying she now has had at least two husbands at this point in her life.
That is a difficult one. I will give you that. That is a difficult one to answer.
I appreciate your honesty.
And I'd have to give that one a little bit of thought. I'd think, but
Fair enough.
I think
there's a lot of difficult questions whenever it comes to philosophical.
But I think that because I'm talking about the consciousness in It's the way we perceive the world. So person B at this point might not perceive himself as being married. He may feel he's now a different person. So, philosophically speaking, then technically no, he's not married anymore. But her perception is that she's still married.
Anymore. But remember, on your position, it is a new person, so you couldn't say anymore because that would assume he was married in the first place, right?
Yeah, I'm tying this, philosophically. I'm thinking of this in philosophically and legally. So, legally, technically, he's still married, but philosophically speaking, he's now not because he's now a different person. So there's definitely a contradiction in that sense of it. That's why I'm saying I'm gonna have to give this one a little bit more thought.
Fair enough. And I would just and to not push back, but just maybe to just add something to it is to just make the point that there's a difference between how he perceives things versus whether or not those things are actual. So there's a difference between our epistemic beliefs and perceptions about the world versus the ontological reality of the world. So if people perceive the world as flat, it doesn't make the world flat, of course. So even if the perception was there, it wouldn't mean ontologically speaking that was the case. So we would have to make that distinction there.
Now, just giving it a little bit more thought there, I think I need to explain a little bit more about how I'm perceiving consciousness in this sense. So I'm thinking of consciousness in the sense of within neuroscience. Say, like I move my arm. Now my brain's already decided to move my arm before I've had the thought to move my arm. And within neuroscience, there's this idea that to explain this, that what's happening is you're not in control of your actions. Your arm moves, and then your brain tries to explain why your arm moved. Then consciously rewrites the memory to say that you chose to move your arm. So in that sense, consciousness in my mind is an illusion. It's something that our brain is writing as a user interface so we can understand what's happening better.
I think I could be along those lines a little bit.
Yeah. So I think going back to the analogy of person A and person B, it would come down to how person B's brain is now going to rewrite the experiences that is now having. So hopefully the brain would, obviously we've not done this, so we don't know how it would work in reality, but I would suppose that person B's brain would rewrite it in so that he is still the same person, is still married to person A. So his perception, although he's not him anymore, he's not the first person anymore, he would still perceive it to be that way because of consciousness being an illusion.
Yeah, so a few things. I would just reiterate the distinction about perception versus reality. Whether he perceived it or not would be independent of whether or not this is the same person or it's a different person. So emergence, you've mentioned emergence a few times. So emergence is a position, and it's a swing at trying to solve what's called the hard problem of consciousness. And I don't see what the problem is, much less it being hard, because it's only, quote, the hard problem of consciousness for a naturalist, which is how can someone who, and I'm not saying you do, but typically naturalists would be emergencies, that how can we explain the existence of whatever this is, consciousness, by, as Nagel would argue, just rearranging physical parts of matter, kind of like Lego bricks to oversimplify it. But I don't think emergence solves a problem of the hard problem of consciousness. I just think it slaps a label on the problem. So even if you were to go to the emergence route, it's not a solution. It's just labeling the solution. And even then, when you look at physical objects, if you're going to talk about emergence, I think the only type of properties that would emerge would be what are called structural properties. A structural property is pretty much what it sounds like at face value. If I have a pile of 10 wooden boards, then I can say that this pile has a property of being, these 10 wooden boards have the property of being a pile. But if I rearrange their structure, then it can now have that same amount of material of wooden boards can now have the property of being a raft. And if I change it again, it's now the property of being a ladder. So you can have these, quote, emergent structural properties, but note that these properties are going to be dependent on the structure and arrangement. But you're not going to get anything new, what would be called in philosophy sui generis, fundamentally new kinds of properties. In other words, I'm not going to rearrange the furniture in my house and get the color blue. I'm not going to take a red brick house and rearrange it and get the color yellow, because those aren't the kind of properties I get from rearranging physical objects. Now, that being said, I don't think consciousness could be an emergent property by just rearranging the structure of neurons. There's a lot more to say that, but I'll just kind of leave it there if you want to push back. And the last thing I want to say before I hand it back over is you said the brain decides before you do. Maybe that was just kind of fast and loose, but let me push back a little bit. Because if you're going to say that the brain decides, then how many consciousnesses are within the body, or wherever you think consciousness is? Is it the brain and then you? What is it? And then at some time, I'd like for you to explain what you mean by consciousness is an illusion, because I don't think I follow.
Well, I just want to jump in here because you started talking about emergence,
Justin,
and that is what I really wanted to jump in on. Whenever it came to your 5, you didn't want to say levels, let's just say types. I can't remember what you referred to them as, or states of consciousness. Now, would you say that those 5 states of consciousness could be emergent from need for adaptability?
I think that's a separate issue to why they emerge, if they did, as to whether or not they could emerge. Because going back to the red brick house, I could say that rearranging red brick houses to get the color yellow was to adapt, but that's irrelevant as to whether or not rearranging red bricks could actually get me the emergent property of yellow. I think those are 2 separate questions.
Do you believe in Dawkins' evolution?
No, I don't. I reject Darwinian evolution. Naturalism.
Or Darwinian. I'm sorry. Gosh, that's so stupid of me. But okay, that's good to know.
Yeah, right.
Yeah. So
now I don't have. Now, while I reject it, there are Christians who do believe in it. I personally don't. But it's also not an issue for me. I wouldn't lose sleep if I were to be convinced that it was true. It wouldn't have any effect, I'd say, on anything that I've said today.
Well, there's no reason to go down the evolution rabbit hole then.
Yeah, I think that's getting a little bit off topic. We can skirt around evolution for today, I think.
Well, I personally believe that it is a product of evolution, but you're right. Yes, we can't skirt around it.
I do as well. So it would be key to my argument, but it is a long conversation. Evolution. So So in response to this, I'll make a change to what I said. So I made a mistake by saying that the brain decides. That was a little bit fast and loose. Sorry about that.
Sorry.
Yeah, so it's not that the brain's deciding. It's it's that the cause is an effect. That the causes create a certain set of effects within the brain. So it's causation, not decision.
Okay, yeah, and just because you're about evolution, if we did go that route, I would bring up another argument that would be related to my free will issue, in that if there is no God and naturalistic evolution were true, then you now have an undercutting defeater for absolutely any belief that your brain produces, including the belief that you lack belief in God or that there is no God. I'm not sure if y'all are familiar with that argument or not. But I would think that would just get into further issues philosophically. So even if I granted your position, I would think it only led to further price tags that you would have to bite the bullet on if that were true.
Yeah, that's that. That's absolutely fine. I can, as I say, it's a bit of a rabbit hole to go down. So probably best, if we have time in a bit, then maybe go down that route. But I think we've got a lot to cover. So, was there any more points you wanted to make, Justin, before we move on?
No, I that's basically what my questions would be about. Would be centered around Darwinian evolution and how, I mean, yeah, like you said, there are Christians that believe in Darwinian evolution, and if you don't, and you don't want to like speak on that, which I completely understand, then I don't know. I'm gonna have to formulate a good question to ask you because, like I said, I believe it is emergent from evolution, so it's kind of hard for me to think of a question on the spot.
Yeah, and the reason, and that would be fine even if you did want to go to that road. I don't have a problem with it. I just, quite frankly, wouldn't have much to contribute. To be honest with you, just because it's not an area of interest for me. The only thing where I would contribute is to say that, kind of what I said earlier, it wouldn't necessarily be relevant as to whether or not this could actually happen in the first place. In other words, suppose. So here's a perfect example. Would you guys claim that this belief in God was something that human beings evolved for adaptationary reasons, perhaps to deal with grief or fear or anything like that?
Yes. So I
Okay.
argue that the belief in God is an emergent property from the right hemisphere of the brain, which deals with rationality and trying to explain things that we don't understand. So,
Right.
That makes
going
sense.
back to the caveman doesn't understand what lightning is, so he gives it the name of a spirit.
Sure.
Is controlling that.
So here's why I asked that in my point is because things can happen evolutionarily speaking that don't necessarily reflect to whether or not that's the way the world actually is, right? So you guys don't believe in God, yet you give an evolutionary explanation as to why people do believe in God and why it tends to be something cross-cultural for the most part. So in other words, it's irrelevant as to why something, quote, emerged or came about as to whether or not the thing in question is true or false. So that being said, one, whether or not it emerged for adaptationary reasons or not, I would say is irrelevant as to the question of, one, did it really happen that way? And two, could it have happened that way metaphysically? So in other words, I would say that question regarding why it emerged evolutionarily speaking would be irrelevant to the arguments that I've been given, kind of like whether or not God exists is a question, and the question of why people believe in God is irrelevant as to whether or not God actually exists in the first place. Does that make sense?
I understand where you're
Yeah,
coming
I can
from,
understand that.
and I think that I go along with what Katie is saying, to where it is an emergence of our brain, and it's a way to, like I said, adapt to our atmosphere. And the reason I was getting down to the evolutionary point is, like I said, or asked you at least, was could these be properties of a oh gosh, I just used the word adaptable standpoint because, well, like as I believe in Darwinian evolution, that adaptability is the primary need to survive in this world.
And the thing with when with rationality is when you're trying to explain things that you don't understand, you, you don't it doesn't always necessarily have to be true, the explanation. So when we were explaining things back with in the evolutionary past, when we were explaining things a certain way, then they didn't necessarily need to be true. They just need to make the most sense at the time. So as we've progressed and now we have more evidence, then we've come to a greater, deeper understanding of things. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that what we're saying tonight is true. In the grand scheme of things, there could be evidence that we're missing.
I truly don't know either. Yeah, you're right. I know I don't know.
Yeah, well, I would say, speak for yourself. What I'm saying is true. So if you,
I think I'm humble enough to say that I don't know everything. I can speculate. I can presuppose. But to say that one thing is for sure, I think that there are too many surprises that happen to say that it's all answerable.
And I was saying that somewhat jokingly, of course. Of course, I do believe what I'm saying is true. But since we're kind of going down this route, or I guess maybe we're not in the rabbit hole, but we're kind of poking around it. So I totally agree with what Katie said. In that, so I've been planning as evolutionary argument against naturalism is one of my favorite and fascinating arguments. That basically, that the gist of it is that our cognitive faculties, however we come to form beliefs, just like everything else that we have today, is granted to us through natural selection for survival value, which means, literally speaking, everything, including our beliefs, are aimed at survival value and not necessarily at truth value. And Katie said it wonderfully, that if that's the case, then our beliefs don't have to be true. They just have to grant survivability or adaptive behavior. So given that you guys agree with that, I don't know if you've heard the argument or not, but here's the illustration I use, which means your beliefs don't have to be true. So suppose there's a car coming towards me, and this, of course, assumes that on physicalism, you can have beliefs in the first place. I don't think you can have beliefs if physicalism is true, because I don't think you can get immaterial conscious states and properties emerging by rearranging Lego bricks, if you will, kind of like the red brick house analogy and the color yellow or blue. But if we just, for the sake of argument, grant that, a car comes towards me, I form the belief a car's coming towards me, I better jump out of the way. Those beliefs cause the behavior of jumping out of the way, and it grants survival value. So for natural selection, that's all that matters. So to personify, it says, looks good enough to me, let's pass those beliefs on to the next generation. It works. But suppose I had a different set of beliefs. A car's coming towards me, and I formed the belief there's a car coming towards me, but I also have the belief that I'm Superman. And if it hits me, it's not going to kill me. However, I want to protect my identity as Clark Kent. So in order to protect my identity, I jump out of the way of the car. So I jump out of the way of the car misses me. Those beliefs, though false, produce behavior that granted survivability. So my beliefs don't have to be true for them to be passed on. They just have to work. It's aiming for survival value, not truth value. If that's the case, then we now have an undercutting defeater that removes any justification for any belief our brain produces, which means if your brain produces a belief there is no God, then we shouldn't trust it, because we know that that belief wasn't produced and aimed at truth. It was just aimed at survivability. So it would, if that's true, then you now have an undercutting defeater for any belief your brain produces.
I don't know if you can have an undercutting defeater if what you're doing is being skeptical at all points, and anytime that something changes, you go through the scientific process to see if there's any merit to it. I mean, I've heard your clock microwave unplugged, and the thing is well, you would realize that the microwave was unplugged, and you would do a process to figure out what time it actually was. So maybe I'm wrong. I would like to hear your thoughts on that at least.
Yeah. So for the listeners who maybe aren't familiar with it, let me just explain that illustration you're referring to it. And I appreciate the fact that you've watched at least one or two of my videos, given that you've heard the illustration. So I'm flattered. Thank you. So the illustration I give in regards to the argument is, I say, imagine you wake up from a nap and you look at the microwave to see what time it is, and the microwave says 12 o'clock. But then you realize it's really hot in the house and there's water under the fridge. And when you look back at the microwave, you actually realize it's blinking 12 o'clock. So then you come to the conclusion, oh, the power went out. Now, initially, you formed the belief it was 12 o'clock based on the reading of the microwave. But now that the power has gone out, you now have an undercutting defeater for the justification that it is 12 o'clock. Why? Because you've based that belief on the microwave, and yet the microwave, the power went out, so now it's no longer something that you can rely on. It's not a reliable mechanism for telling time. That's the problem I think you have with the brain and Darwinian evolution. If there's no God. But now what you're saying is, but we can test them. But the problem with that is, to me, going back to the illustration, that's like saying, oh, I thought it was 12 o'clock, but now I know the power went out. Is it 12 o'clock? Well, it could be, it could not be. At this point, I don't know. But you know what? I do believe it's 12 o'clock. So let me test that. And then you run to your bedroom and you look at the alarm clock, which is also plugged into the wall and connected to the power. And you see that your alarm clock says 12 o'clock. And you say, I knew it. See, I had a belief and I tested it. Well, the problem, of course, is that whatever the power outage that affected the microwave and made the microwave an unreliable mechanism for determining the time has equally affected the alarm clock. So you cannot use your justification that it is 12 o'clock because of the microwave and then justify the reading of the microwave by your alarm clock because they were both affected by the power outage.
Science is all about finding unreliable mechanisms and then perfecting the idea of them.
How can you rely on something that's unreliable?
I mean, so you find that it's not 12 o'clock because, time is clearly moving and both clocks, neither one is working. So neither one of them is an undercutting defeater, because at that point you realize that the clocks are not a substantial source of information and you need to come up with a different way of gaining that information.
Yeah, so that's sorry.
Oh, sorry. No, go for it.
Okay, so I was saying, yeah, so perfect. That's exactly the point, though, because the illustration is analogous to the brain and naturalistic evolution. With regards to naturalistic evolution, your brain would be the microwave, and if you're going to agree with me that it's no longer a reliable mechanism for telling time, then you're exactly right. You would have to find another way of.
But our brains aren't microwaves. Our brains can problem solve.
So, well, let me finish the thought first, and then no, it's fine. In other words, bring that up after I finish my thought, because I'll forget what you said.
Yeah, I'm so sorry.
No, no need to apologize. So, in other words, you would have to find a different mechanism to tell the time. But let's say you were limited only to the microwave and your alarm clock. Well, then there's no way you're going to know what time it is if those are the only things you're using. Now, with regards to naturalistic evolution, if you now know your brain is like the microwave, it's been affected by the power outage, what else can you use but your brain to do anything? Well, nothing. So if you're stuck with the microwave, you're not going to know what time it is, because the undercutting defeater is the power went out, so it's no longer a reliable mechanism for determining truth. Well, if the microwave is analogous to the brain, then you're stuck using it, and no matter what experiment that you do, no matter what you take, and if we're going to throw in, because this is related to the free will issue, it has the same implications. If there's no free will, then your very beliefs that your beliefs are true are equally undercutted and are equally determined, and it's just pushing back the goalposts.
Yeah, so I'd like to jump in. Hernandez is saying, not a good example to anyone with decent critical thinking skills. And I think that I can elaborate on that a little bit. So I think a better analogy for our brains wouldn't be the clock on your microwave, but would be a clock that's connected to the internet. So if there was a power outage on the source that the clock was using, and the clock became unreliable, then yes, the information coming in is now false and is not reliable. So it's connected to the internet, though. So you would change the source. You would find a new source that is reliable. And I think that's a better analogy for what happens with our brains. Using critical thinking skills, we're able to realize when the information is unreliable and when we need to go and search for a more reliable source.
Yeah, but I think changing the illustration doesn't help the point, because even in changing the illustration, you still conceded that if the source itself is what's flawed, and unreliable, then you need to change sources. But that's just the point. You can't change if naturalistic evolution is what gave us our brains, and we've already discussed it's not aiming at truth necessarily, it's aiming at survival and adaptive behavior, then you can't change the source because all you have is your brain. And if you point to someone else's brain or something else, you're still caught in the same problem. And if you give up free will, then saying we can recognize when we need to change sources is really technically saying I am causally determined to believe that I am right or wrong, and I'm causally determined to believe that I need to change, and I'm causally determined to believe that the best way to change is to change to this method, even if in fact all of that is false. But you're going to be determined to believe it no matter what. And I think that's the problem with giving up free will, is you cannot have intellectual integrity.
When I say changing the source, I don't mean changing the brain, changing the actual physical parts to it. So the brain it's got two things to it. So you've got the physical matter there, that's thing, but it's a computer. It is an advanced computer. So it takes in information. So so it's able to, when I say change the source, I mean change the source of the information that's coming into it. So because it processes information and outputs it as consciousness, or a user interface, if you like, if we're going to talk about computers.
So can I ask you the question that I like to ask all people who hold to the deterministic view that you do, if you're okay with that?
Yeah, I'm fine with that.
So you don't believe in free will, correct?
No, I don't believe in free will. I believe in a deterministic, so it's two parts. I believe in probability and determinism. So under probability, before an action's taken place, there's a certain number of outcomes that can happen given the set of causation. And then once it's happened, it's then determined.
So here's a question I'd like to ask. Did you freely come to believe that we don't have free will?
No.
Okay. So why should anyone believe that we don't have free will in other words, if I take a mechanism that was determined or random, set inside the microwave, let's use a magic 8 ball. You may have heard me use this one as well. And I shake the magic 8 ball and say, will it rain? It says yes. I shouldn't necessarily believe it because it's not designed for truth. It's determined by even if determinism should, whatever you want to put in there. Why should I believe it? So if you're saying there is no free will, even if you give me the reasons you came to believe it, that's no different than shaking the magic 8 ball every time. It's not a rational, and I'm not saying you're not rational. I'm saying on your position, there could not be rationality in that sense because it's all going to be determined, and you're just going to be determined to believe that your beliefs are rational, even if in fact they are not.
Well, this is where the what I was talking about earlier with the illusion, and I know that you asked me to go further into that. But this is where I put in that the consciousness is an illusion, so everything is determined, and then our brains give us the sense of free will, give us a sense of consciousness, so that we're able to function better with the thoughts, the feelings, the beliefs, and all of that.
It's emergent from adaptability.
Yeah. So so in my sense, so the way I look at it is it's an illusion in the sense of the computer operating system that you're looking at right now is an illusion. It's not there. It's ones and zeros. But you can't understand the ones and zeros. So we code the ones and zeros in a certain way so that you are able to visually see a user interface. When you clicked on the link to join into this, that link didn't exist. It wasn't a link that physically existed somewhere. It was a set of ones and zeros that was graphically made so you were able to click it. But at its base, it was just ones and zeros, and that's the same with our brains. So our brains are just a collection of neurons and chemicals, but we can't understand neurons and chemicals. So what our brains do is they give us a user interface. They write us up a set of senses that we're able to use to understand things, and give us a consciousness.
2 questions. One's just for clarification, so you can just be brief if you want, because I'm just trying to understand it. When you say consciousness is illusion, do you mean free will is an illusion, or do you mean all the conscious states that I mentioned are an illusion?
So yeah, free will is an illusion. In my mind, that is definitely an illusion. Now, the properties are sort of an illusion and sort of not of an illusion in some senses. So, we perceive them as being real, hence they're real in that in that sense. But they are just an output from our brain.
But they're a real output, right?
Yeah, so our brain is outputting things, but we perceive them very differently to how they, how they are output from the brain. In a sense, I'm not a neuroscientist, so I'm not fully versed on this. But
yeah, I notice you're saying, and here's the other thing that I wanted to ask was, I notice you're saying our brain gives us this, and our brain outputs this to us. I'm curious as to what you mean. Yeah. Who is the us? So
language lets us down a bit here. That's.
I'm sorry.
Language is letting us down a little bit here. These are concepts which are quite hard to explain in language, but.
Yeah. I think the way I explain them in language, I think work. Of course, you disagree, but I think there's some intuition going on there that. Even if so, I'm fine with saying that in some instances our brain can give us mental states. I have no problem with that. You can put electrodes on my brain and shock me and make me, believe that I'm in Hawaii. I have no problem with that. But there is a distinction between me, the self, and the brain. So I guess for your position, it would have to be a question of what is the I, the self? Is it a brain? Is it a brain and body? And then, of course, those go into the issues I've already mentioned. But who is the brain giving these things to? Who's having the illusion? And I don't even know if you can call it an illusion. I think I get what you're saying, but I don't know if illusion would be the right word. But like, for example, when I have a feeling of pain, that's a conscious state, but it's not an illusion. It's quite vivid. It's quite real. Even if it's phantom limb pain, there's no illusion going on there, I'd say.
Yeah, so the obviously with pain, let's take that. That's actually a good example. So with pain, what's actually happening is obviously the nerve endings are being damaged. So your nervous system is being damaged, and then that is being input into the brain, and the output of that is the feeling of pain. So the input is very real. That the nerve endings have been affected, so the physical state has been altered, but the output is what is the illusion. You feel the pain. There's a feeling there. That's the illusion. That your brain is outputting to you. Maybe illusion is maybe not the best way of terming that. I'm trying to think of another term for it now, but. Maybe can you think of another term for that, Fad?
Dude, I'm so sorry. I was kind of thinking about my mind can't get off of this one set of questioning. I'm trying to. Yeah, I'm sorry. I don't. If you could say what you were saying again, maybe I could help you.
Yeah, so I was talking about how, and Eric put forward an analogy which is quite good, which is pain. So we feel pain, and so the pain is real. Now, what I'm saying is that the nerve endings being affected, that's real, and that is being input into the brain. Now, the brain is outputting a feeling of pain. The feeling itself is an illusion. That's just what the brain is outputting to us to let us know that something is up in the body. Something is wrong there. Now,
okay.
We're saying maybe illusion is the wrong word.
Okay, well, I mean, if you were to say that, then a lot of things have consciousness. And that's actually kind of along the questioning I wanted to ask was, I mean, you were willing to go down and say that a dog has consciousness, and you thought that maybe it may be futile to go down and ask if fleas have consciousness. But very apparently, the line of questioning that we're talking about is, pain a part of consciousness. I have a very pointed question, though. Regarding the 5 types.
Before you get into that, I've just got another.
Yeah. Go for it, please.
Josh
please.
has just messaged in the chat. He's saying hallucinations, and I would agree with that. So the brain is basically making you hallucinate the sense of pain. And the same with consciousness. You're hallucinating consciousness.
I would say that that's good. And like I say, I think that that's all emergent from what I'm kind of getting to. The question is, if you lose one of those 5 types of consciousness, are you still conscious? How many, if you only have one, are you still conscious in your viewpoint?
Yeah.
Yeah. So if you only have one, you're still conscious. So I would be willing to bet that you would be pretty open to saying that things of a very wide range of things can have consciousness if it doesn't need all 5 tenets. Yeah. So what about like cells and stuff? Could they be conscious?
They could be. I don't know if I have any reason to think they are.
Well, if they rely on the tenets, which I was asking you earlier, if they could be emergent from properties of adaptability, which would be helping survive. It's basically getting down to that question is, do you think that it could be emergent if cells are showing some sort of consciousness and it is only not leveling up, but there are different types of consciousness coming into existence as things become different. I don't want to say evolve because I know it's not exactly what you believe in, but from this point of view, from this framework, that's what it is. As we evolve, I see that we could have those 5 points of consciousness, but maybe only started as one, and through working to adapt and survive, we believe, just as Katie was saying, we see or comprehend a consciousness as a way to survive. I mean, we don't see everything that's in front of us. We see only what we need to survive, correct? Like, we don't need to see the quantum realm or anything of that nature.
It would be pretty cool, though, because I did like the Ant-Man movie. If we can.
Yeah.
Lots I could touch on there, but maybe just to keep it as relevant as possible. I'd have to hear reasons why someone would think cells are conscious before I could buy into it. In other words, saying that it's possible doesn't mean I believe it. They are. It just means, sure, I'm open to it. But, I guess you could say I'm agnostic on it. I'd have to hear reasons why. And unless I hear convincing reasons, I don't have a reason to think that they are conscious. But even if you're to go with...
Oh, I'm sorry. I was just going on the 5 tenets that you were saying. And you said that it could be reduced down to even 1 tenet, and consciousness could still be there. And I believe I asked you earlier if, maybe I just lost track. Katie,
you asked me about a
cast a brain fart.
With consciousness of the cells, you're on your own with this one, because that.
Well, but what basically is what I'm saying. I could see that it relates to your tenets. If you can reduce it down to even one of these tenets, I believe that consciousness definitely could be a faculty in adaptation.
Yeah, I'm still not sure if I follow, but even if we were to
Mm.
reduce it down to one faculty, I guess I'd still have to hear which faculty someone would think that a cell, which state of consciousness would a cell have.
Survivability, adaptation.
Mm.
That's not a state of consciousness.
Okay, what were your five states again? I mean, it if only
Thoughts,
one.
thoughts,
Thoughts,
beliefs, sensations, desires, or acts of will.
and none of those have anything to do with survivability.
Well, they have. If by have to do with you mean, do we think about these things? Sure, but I don't. In other words, natural selection has to do with survivability, but natural selection isn't conscious. It's not a thing, right? It's not something out there, so to speak. So
I
you can
agree.
have, right? So you can have natural selection without consciousness. So I don't see why saying that having consciousness can aid in survivability, therefore survivability would have to do with consciousness. It's kind of
I don't necessarily believe in a consciousness. Where I'm coming from is exactly where Katie's coming from. Is it's an illusion, or not an illusion of sorts, but
Hallucination.
it's like I said earlier, we're only seeing the parts that we need to see to survive.
Well, I
And
don't even think you're seeing
our
that much.
idea of consciousness is a very good way to adapt to our current surroundings. And as you said, it could be reduced to even one state. Well, if we have consciousness that is changing through, I guess whatever you would say, how whatever's making consciousness change, perhaps the complexity of the brain or whatever it is. Um, Actually, that's a good question. What is making consciousness change? If you could deduce it down to one level, or not level, but one trait of consciousness equals consciousness. What evolved to all five traits? Like, why?
Well, again, a few things. I'm curious to what I'm saying this, not so you can answer now, just so I don't forget it. One thing that crossed my mind was I'm curious to on y'all's view, what is it that possesses consciousness? So maybe you can just think of that, but I don't want to forget that question, so I'm saying it now. What, on your view, what possesses consciousness? What is the thing that's conscious? And now, to answering your questions, you were asking about what evolved to have all five states. So given that I don't accept evolution, but even if I were, it still sounds like, whether intentional or not, it sounds like you're kind of asking me to like give you a list of what, like, here's what fits here, here's what fits there, here's what fits there.
Is there going to be another state of consciousness?
I don't think so. But I don't. So I think everything has an essential nature. This goes back to the metaphysics. I think you as a person have a certain nature, and I think that nature is grounded in your soul. And within your soul, there are certain capacities, certain latent powers within you. But you're not going to change your nature. So take an acorn and take my son who's 3 years old. An acorn within its nature has a capacity to, if I plant it in the ground, grow a root system and become a tree. But if I plant my son in the ground, he's not going to grow a root system and become a tree because he doesn't have those capacities. So I think everything already has these capacities. That's one of the reasons I would even reject on some versions of evolution, especially naturalistic evolution, that you would have natures changing this way. But I don't want to go down that route. So what I'm saying is something exists, and its nature is what tells us whether or not it has those capacities to have those five states, because perhaps not everything that's conscious can have those five states. And how do we know what has those five states? Well, in an a posteriori sense, which means after investigating, we can find correlations between certain regions of the brain and that are correlated with certain cognitive thinking. Like, for example, there's a certain part of the brain associated with language. We know some animals don't have this part of the brain, so I think it's safe to say that they don't have language, and at the very least, we can even say definitely not in the way that we have language. So I think we can look at things in that sense. And that could give us an indication of what type of soul a thing has, if you will.
Yeah, okay. And I mean, I'm trying to put myself there. It's hard for me to come because the idea of a soul to me is probably the exact same idea of consciousness. They're emerging in my ideas from the same place. And it is out of adaptability. It's just, and it's not going to get us anywhere going in circles with that.
When you say
So
when you say consciousness and the soul emerges from adaptability,
I don't believe in consciousness. Like I said, the idea of consciousness. Now, I think that as we evolved,
can you explain that? Can you
go
explain
for
that?
it.
You said no. I said, can you explain that? You said you don't believe in consciousness.
Yeah, no, I don't. I believe it's a just an illusion that helps us adapt and survive.
So beliefs are a state of consciousness. So if you don't believe in consciousness, then you're going to have to essentially say that you don't believe that people have beliefs.
That's I have a bunch of presuppositions from day to day, but it is based on my presuppositions that I can trust the things that I'm seeing and the things that I'm hearing from these sources that I have lended credence to.
But you're saying you have presuppositions.
Well, I I understand what presuppositions are, but I don't exactly. I can't say that they are true. I can't say there is a truth, to be honest, from my perspective. But my perspective is all kinds of weird, to be honest, because I just, like I said, we were talking earlier. I am okay with saying I don't know, and I can work off presuppositions. I can work off of people that I give authority to or ideas that I give authority to. But to say I know is folly, in my opinion.
But all I'm
And that's
saying
why
is,
I like to hear what people know or think they
yeah,
know.
sure. And all I'm saying is, when you're talking about presuppositions, you're talking about presuppositional beliefs. And if beliefs are a state of consciousness, but if you deny consciousness, you're essentially going to have to say, as atheist Alex Rosenberg does say, that you would have to believe that people don't have beliefs, which is a self-contradiction. So I don't see how you can avoid consciousness existing when you have beliefs.
Yeah, I mean, I believe I have beliefs right now. I don't know that I have beliefs in 15 minutes from now. I can't promise you that. I don't have the mathematical um, equation in front of me or the proof to say, for sure. I personally don't. I rely on authorities, and the authorities that I rely on seem to have a lot more credence than some of the other beliefs that I have given my time to. And I am a strong believer in Darwinian evolution, and that kind of just changes the whole game.
But you're still talking about beliefs, which is a conscious
Yeah.
state. Let me ask you if so. You're
Can I
talking about
just
authority.
interject something quickly?
Sure.
So when it comes to beliefs, I might be able to clarify a little bit on this. When it comes to beliefs, we're not presupposing that beliefs are connected to the soul, to say, not connected to ourselves. We don't think that we can choose our beliefs. Our beliefs are determined already. So we're not choosing what we believe, if that helps at all.
Yeah, I get, and I even agree for the most part there. What I was just getting at is if I understood him just incorrectly, he said that he didn't believe in consciousness or didn't believe consciousness was real, and I simply said that, well, a belief is a state of consciousness. So if you believe consciousness isn't real, you're essentially going to have to believe that there are no beliefs. But he just said he does have beliefs. So It's kind of like the person who doubts they exist. You know, someone says, I don't know if I exist. And you say, well, who's doubting? And they say, well, me. Like, oh, well, but in order to doubt your existence, you have to first exist in order for you to doubt that you exist in the first place. Someone who doesn't exist cannot doubt their existence. So I think that that's kind of the same issue we're having here is if someone who denies that consciousness exists is having a belief about people not having beliefs.
I don't see how. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, Justin. Here,
You're muted, Justin.
Oh, well, I was just going to ask, can you prove to me that somebody believes they don't exist can't, like, basically, can you prove what you said about the person that doesn't believe they exist? Or actually existing or whatever. I can't remember exactly what you're saying, but
I was just showing the contradiction in someone who doubts their existence. The ironic.
Is it a contradiction? Can you prove it?
Well, I think it's self-evident that in order to doubt your existence, you have to first exist. If you want to doubt that, you're going to have to show me how something can doubt its own existence without existing.
I
can see what Eric's getting at there, definitely.
Oh, me as well. These are just questions that questions I have, and he seems to have reasonable answers. So I'm enjoying talking with him.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that very much.
And it would be a contradiction, but as we said before, beliefs don't necessarily have to be true. So someone who doesn't believe that they exist, they haven't chosen to believe that. Whatever they think the evidence is has convinced them that they don't exist.
Sure, our beliefs don't have to necessarily be true, but we know that necessarily contradictory beliefs cannot be true.
Exactly, and I will, I do agree with that. That would be they're committing quite a major fallacy there, in saying that they don't exist.
Yeah. So, and Justin was talking about authorities earlier. I mean, what authority would you appeal to know whether or not you're in pain?
What authority would I appeal to whether, like I said, from what I understand from around me, these, what I have or what we have evolved as a species or any species to keep us alive, to adapt to our surroundings. It's something, it's a neuron firing off in the brain. And some people don't even have that ability to feel. And right, it's very detrimental to them.
But my question was, because you're saying, and maybe I just misunderstood you, but
I'm sorry.
It sounded like you were saying that you appeal to authorities for certain things, but surely when
I do. I don't know math, I don't know that the sun, I haven't traveled to the sun to feel that it's to know that it's a raging ball of gas and fire or whatever it is. I do have to rely on authorities on a lot of these things, but I think that
But do you know when you're in pain?
Do you know do I know? No, I could be wrong. All the time I could be wrong, but for a long time, and at some point it kind of fades into the back. And pain is a subjective term anyways. Pain to one person isn't necessarily what pain is to another person either.
Right, but that's irrelevant as to whether or not you know you're in pain. I'm not asking about the degree of what someone experienced. I'm just saying if you know you're in pain. I don't see how you can be in pain. Go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, what is it then? What is pain in your?
Right, great question. So, and before answering that, so my point there was just you don't appeal to authority to know when you're in pain, which I think is another argument that would go to lend credibility to my position about mental states, these conscious states not being something physical or physical properties. Because when I know I'm in pain, I don't have to consult a neurosciences. I don't like, hammer a nail into my hand on accident and be like, it's bleeding. and then, call my doctor, set up an appointment, and, oh, we don't have an opening till tomorrow, 5 p.m. Tomorrow, 5 p.m., I go to the doctor, and he says, so what's the problem? I say, I have a nail in my hand. Can you look at my brain to tell me if I'm in pain? Say, okay, yeah, sure. So they set up a machine. 30 minutes later, they look, oh, yeah, you're in pain. And they go, and I say, I am in pain. Yeah. Oh, okay. Oh, my gosh, how? And I start screaming, right? Obviously, I don't need to consult with any authority to know whether or not I'm in pain. But to know whether or not I have brain defects, I would have to consult an authority, because conscious states are privately accessible, and it's something that only I have privileged access to, whereas my brain states, which are physical, are publicly accessible to anybody who can open my skull. So, and what was your question? I'm sorry.
Well, I think you would still have to appeal to authority whenever it comes to pain. Like I said, there are some people that don't feel pain, and there are all sorts of chemical reactions going off in your brain. And sometimes you're in shock and you don't even know that you broke your leg until somebody tells you. And then it's just as you described. Then all of a sudden you're screaming because you realize, oh, your leg is broken. I mean, I feel like there are plenty of examples of the opposite of what you were saying.
Well, I don't think what you gave was an opposite. Note you said you don't even know your leg's broken until someone tells you. But that wasn't my point. My point was pain. You don't know, you don't wait till someone tells you that you're in pain to know you're in pain, but that's different than knowing whether or not your leg is broken. So I can...
Wouldn't the pain indicate, like, to you, isn't that the first indicator?
What's the first indicator?
The pain that something is wrong.
Uh-huh.
And then, so if you're not having that pain at all, and somebody has to tell you your leg is broken, and then you realize that, oh shit, your leg's broken, you're in a lot of pain. Are you not appealing to or authority? Is an authority not like, because of the chemicals going off in your brain, you cannot determine what the reality around you is until somebody brings you back to reality?
So I think you're confusing two questions. One question, am I in pain? Second question, is my leg broken? So let's put these two questions on the board. Am I in pain? Is my leg broken? They ask me the first question. Am I in pain? I say no. They ask me the second question. Is your leg broken? I could say, I don't know. I'd have to check. So I can have an answer to one question, even if I don't have an answer to the other, but that's not the same thing as whether or not I'm in pain. Because I could even say, because I could be on PCP, and they ask, am I in pain? I say, no. Is your leg broken? Yeah, the bone's sticking out. Still not in pain, though. So I think you're confusing what causes pain with pain itself or pain behavior.
I could see what you're saying. I just, like I say, and you're right. I mean, drugs will influence that. But I was coming from the idea of the natural processes of the brain and the fact that without the influence of extra substances, you can do something that is clearly painful and not be in pain until you realize you were actually hurt because of shock, because of these endorphins and things that we have in our body that release to keep us from knowing these things. And sometimes all it takes is somebody to, like I said, bring you back into reality, to where you're not blinded by this adrenaline and these endorphins, and this pain becomes very real.
So I think you're
I could be confused.
I'm not saying that you're confused. I just think you're confusing two different questions, because you can't say something is clearly painful and yet someone's not in pain. What you could say is someone's in a state which would be clearly painful to me, yet it's not painful to them, because you even talked about, and I forget the medical term, but there are cases where there are people who do not feel pain. They don't have those type of receptors. And it's actually very hard and dangerous for them. In fact, there's a girl, I forget her name off the top of my head, and I can't believe I forgot. Cognitive insensitivity to pain, I think is what it's called. Could be getting that wrong. But basically, I mean, from the time she was born, I mean, they had to watch her like a hawk. I mean, they put goggles on her eyes because one time she had something in her eye that caused her to itch. So she was scratching at it, and they weren't supervising her. They didn't know until, she was able to basically walk and do other stuff. But like they weren't supervising her. They come back later, and the girl nearly gouged her eye out. They had to put mittens on her because as she was teething, and they literally had to pull her teeth out, because as she was teething, they, again, not supervising her, they'd come back and she would have a mouthful of blood and pretty much chewed her tongue off and chewed her fingers off and chewed her lips off because she was teething and wanted something to chew on. But she could not feel pain. Now, that would clearly be painful to me, but it wasn't painful to her. So, and my point is, pain, which is part of a mental state of being a sensation, you don't need any authority to appeal to know you're in pain, because it's not, even if caused by and correlated with something physical, it is still something that is a conscious state. And I would argue consciousness is not physical. And this is why I also think you could have phantom limb pain, where people who don't have, let's say, 2 legs in the middle of the night wake up with leg pain when they have no legs. So again, there's a correlation between the physical, but I think the mental state itself, consciousness, is not something physical.
Right, I think we're going to have to start closing the stream down, because we have been going for like 2 hours now. I was going to mention that I'm having a after party similar to what we had on the AA show.
Hey, congratulations, by the way, Katie. You
Yes.
definitely reached your 100 subscriber goal.
Yeah,
so.
I'm over the moon about that.
Yeah,
so I'm
very
not sure
excited.
whether you want to, if you've got time, if you want to stay on for a little bit, and there's a couple of people in the chat who would love to have a little chat with you.
Yeah, I can do that. I can stay on for a little bit longer.
So I'll get the stream closed down. I'll get some links sent out to the after party. If anyone who wants to jump onto the after party, I've got a couple of people who've already messaged. But if there's more than 3 people who want to join in, then I will move over to another, move away from StreamYard, because I can only have 6 people in at one time. But we'll see how that goes. Anyway, thank you very much, Eric, for coming on. That was I really enjoyed this conversation.
Thank you. Likewise.
Yeah.
I think it's been very informative for the viewers. It's been very informative for me and Justin, I think, as well.
I enjoyed it thoroughly,
yeah.
so thank you as well.
So please, everyone in the chat, we have 2 shows a week, Mondays and Fridays at 8 p.m. EST, Eastern Time. So please tune in for the next show, which is obviously going to be Friday. And please remember, ignorance is never bliss. And this is the Borg Skeptic Show, assimilation of knowledge. Thank you very much, and good night.